The Lord governs by common consent. He will not force anyone, let alone his church, to obey his commandments without consent. But what is, exactly, common consent? Consent, as is generally understood, is the approval or acceptance of a proposal from another person. One person makes a proposition and another accepts, meaning consents. Or the second party rejects the proposal, meaning he or she does not consent. Common consent is consent given by a group. This is normally determined by a vote, where the majority decides whether consent is given or not. Common consent can only be given when three conditions are present. They are obvious but necessary to understand. First, whatever is being proposed, the proposal must always precede the giving of consent. Ratification of an action after the fact is not consent. Second, common consent must be given to the proposal of another person. And third, with common consent, there must always be a vote of all members of the group, which must be then counted with the majority vote carrying the motion. Agency is not to be confused with the freedom to act without constraint. Agency means the capacity to act or exert power, but it is also representational, meaning that the acting and exerting power is within the term set by another person. This is the context that the agency of man must be understood. The Lord did not state that man could go down and do anything he wanted. Man was to go down to choose whether he would do everything God commanded him or not. Agency, in this context, comes with accountability. There are bounds and expectations for this gift of action and power. Man is accountable for the way in which he uses his moral agency. If used unwisely, this is called sin. The law of common consent is the gospel law that makes active both moral agency and accountability in God's dealing with mankind in the collective sense, whether it be with his church, his people Israel, or his family as in the premortal council. God gives man a law or commandment or proposed calling, which man can then choose to accept or reject, individually or collectively. This is the law of common consent. Man uses his moral agency to make the choice, and then afterwards experience the consequences of that choice, which is called accountability. In all things, the Lord never forces his will on any one person or group. Common consent is an eternal principle and is found in God's dealings with his children in all dispensations and at all times. This holds true in the council prior to mortality. As the scriptures describe, there was a council in heaven where it was proposed and then decided who was to become the Redeemer of mankind. The council voted, and the majority decided that it would be the one like unto the Son of Man. This is a classic example of the law of common consent, where the Lord makes a proposal to his children. They vote, and the majority of votes decides whether the proposal is accepted or rejected. Unfortunately, the devil and 1/3 of the hosts of heaven rebelled and sought to overturn the council decision by force. The problem was not that 1/3 of the members of the council cast their votes against the proposed Savior, but that they tried to seize power in defiance of the vote of common consent. The law of common consent allows for honest dissent. It does not, however, allow open rebellion. The law of common consent was also the rule in ancient Israel. When Moses explained the new laws and commandments he had received from the Lord on the Mount, he asked the people to accept the law by voice vote. The vote was unanimous, with the law of Moses becoming binding upon the nation. Later, after the conquest of the Promised Land and before his death, Joshua asked the Israelites to renew their previous covenant under Moses by a voice vote, which they did. When Israel was under the system of judges, with Samuel the chief judge of the land, the elders of Israel approached him and demanded that he be replaced with a king. The Lord responded by allowing Israel to exercise its agency and applied the law of common consent. He gave them the choice to continue with the system of judges or install a system of kingship. He strongly discouraged this second option, but allowed the nation to vote. When the vote favored the choice of having a king, the Lord respected their vote under common consent. At the Jerusalem conference, where Paul and Barnabas met with Peter, James, and the other apostles, along with the whole church, it was decided to send Judas Barsabbas and Silas to go with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch to preach the gospel. The book of Acts records that this action, the calling of missionaries, was done by a vote, which was with one accord or unanimous. These men were first chosen, as the record indicates, and then approved by the vote of the conference. Judas and Silas were called and approved to be missionaries under the law of common consent. The Lord reaffirmed the law of common consent in this dispensation as well as in previous dispensations and in premortality. All matters were to be put to a vote. Ordination to priesthood offices in the Lord's church requires a vote of the church in all but one case. The one exception, ordinations in the mission field, where there is no branch, was made since there were no members to hold a vote under common consent. Where there were branches or organized stakes, a vote of common consent was necessary. Priesthood licenses given to those who had been ordained were also subject to a vote of the church, or from a conference where business was decided by a vote. All callings in the church were to be appointed by the voice of the church, meaning a vote of the church. The law of common consent requires that all those desiring to become members of the church first be accepted by a vote of the church before baptism, and then again before confirmation. It is the church members that determine worthiness. This also means that continued worthiness to be a member of the church was also determined by a vote of the church. Revelation in the church was and is subject to acceptance by a vote of the church under the law of common consent. This principle, called canonization, was observed from the beginning by the church. In 1835, the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants was accepted at a General Assembly in Kirtland, Ohio, by a unanimous vote. Voting in the early church was not a pro forma exercise. It was a real vote, where candidates for office proposed by the Lord could be voted in or out. It was not a sustaining vote as currently practiced in the church. During the presidency of Joseph Smith, for example, Joseph had planned to replace Sidney Rigdon as his first counselor in the first presidency. However, the membership of the church voted to retain President Rigdon at a special conference held in October 1843. Joseph personally refused to accept Rigdon as his counselor, but the vote stood. Earlier, in November 1837, Joseph nominated Frederick G. Williams as a counselor in the first presidency, but the motion was rejected by a vote of the conference in favor of Hyrum Smith. Furthermore, as Joseph Smith explained in a letter to Orson Hyde and John E. Page, the vote of a church unit had the authority, under the law of common consent, to override the authority of the Quorum of 12 Apostles and the 70 if it so chose. In other words, the members of the church could choose to retain an apostate high priest at the head of their congregation and reject any attempt of the 70 or the 12 to remedy the situation. The law of common consent trumps everything. When the Lord commands that all things must be done by common consent, he never really explained what all things included, though he did give some examples. The business of the church was conducted at conferences. The primary business of conferences was priesthood ordinations and the issuing of licenses, but it included a wide array of decisions, including those listed from the minutes of conferences recorded in the history of the church. All decisions were voted upon at the conferences. Unfortunately, the law of common consent was not fully practiced under Joseph Smith. Joseph repeatedly violated this law, particularly during the Nauvoo period, when he secretly introduced polygamy and the temple ordinances. The members of the church at large were unaware of these practices and were never given the right to accept them by a vote of common consent. As the church confirms in its preface to section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the revelation was recorded in 1843, but its principles were known and practiced well before that date. It was not added to the scriptural canon until 1876, when polygamy had been openly practiced for many years. In December 1834, Joseph ordained Oliver Cowdery as an assistant president without a prior vote by the church. Though the ordination was according to the will of the Lord, a vote of the church prior to the ordination was required. As might be expected, Joseph's pattern of secret ordinations and the introduction of practices without the knowledge or consent of the members of the church continued with Brigham Young and successor presidents up to the present day. The most well-known practice of secret ordination is that of the reorganization of the first presidency after the death of a president of the church. A new president is set apart in a secret meeting of the remaining apostles in the temple. This follows a pattern set at the installation of Wilford Woodruff as president. The senior apostle, by rule, becomes the new president, who then selects his counselors. While the action is ratified at a solemn assembly held at the next general conference, ratification is not common consent. A vote of common consent, as the scriptures plainly state, must always be given before an ordination and not after. Ratification does not absolve the violation of common consent, nor does the fact that this is a well-established pattern. In today's church, a vote of common consent has been transformed into a sustaining vote. To sustain is not to give consent. To sustain is to continue, maintain, or affirm. Sustaining, whether by vote or by action, means that an action has already taken place or is in process. Sustaining, by definition, comes after the fact. Consent must always be given before an action takes place. Though the church states that all members have the right and privilege of sustaining or not sustaining actions and decisions, the truth of the matter is that there is a penalty for not sustaining. Besides, this statement by the church tacitly admits that the decisions and actions of church leaders have already taken place before any sustaining vote. This is not consent. The Lord never used the word sustain or sustaining in the context of a vote in the Doctrine and Covenants. Alternatively, he commanded that a true vote of the church was necessary at least 9 times. Although the act of sustaining leaders is called a vote by the Church, it cannot be considered so under any reasonable norms. The sustaining vote of a General Conference clearly violates any semblance of a vote, as the following clip clearly demonstrates.
President Monson has asked that I now present the general officers and area 70s of the Church for sustaining vote. Those in favor may manifest it. Those opposed, if any, may manifest it. President Monson, insofar as I have been able to observe, the voting in the conference center has been unanimous.
Note that when President Eyring conducts the vote, he does not look around the conference center to see upraised hands. He also adds the wording "if any," which is a form of suggestion to discourage the voting in the negative. Lastly, he notes that the voting in the conference center has been unanimous. Yet the Lord requires that the whole church is allowed to vote, with every vote counted to determine a majority. When were the other 15 million votes counted? What was the exact vote count? Of course, the brethren have not provided for a process for votes of the membership of the church to be recorded and counted. The Temple Recommend practice of requiring the sustaining of general and local leaders further degrades the law of common consent. One of the questions asks if the applicant sustains the president and other general officers of the church, as well as local leaders. An answer in the negative precludes receiving a Temple Recommend, which denies members access to the temple, its ordinances, and significant callings in the church. But true consent must always be given without penalty or any other form of coercion. The requirement of sustaining leadership radically alters the law of common consent into a practice of coercion, which was the adversary's plan from the beginning. The Temple Recommend is not the only violation of common consent in the modern church. The brethren now administer the church and govern the members using handbooks and manuals that have not been accepted by a vote of common consent. One of the handbooks, Handbook 1 for stake presidents and bishops, is even withheld from the general membership of the church. In summary, the law of common consent is a universal and mandatory principle which the Lord commands as a foundation for His church. Nothing is to be done in the church without prior permission, meaning consent. Consent cannot be constrained or penalized, otherwise it is no longer consent. Anything more or less than this leads to bondage.